Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC for short, is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversation, intellectual dialogue, and exchange of ideas, art, and culture. Today's session is the new knowledge economy. Can India compete? We have with us today Dr. Anil Kakodkar, former chairperson, Atomic Energy Commission of India and director of ECAGRID, Dr. Arogyaswamy Paulraj, professor emeritus, Stanford University and chancellor designate, ECAGRID. And our moderator for tonight is Adityanath Jha, CEO, Crayon Pictures. Research and development intensive high-tech industries will dominate the new knowledge economy. Currently, India has a negligible presence. Building world-class multidisciplinary research in universities is essential to close this gap. The next few decades are going to be critical in high-end technologies like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, computing and telecom, energy and battery, commercial aircraft, space, pharmaceuticals, and in emerging frontier technologies exploiting genetics, quantum physics, cognitive and brain sciences. Only nations with top global multidisciplinary research universities will have the ability to enter this new technology. In tonight's session, Dr. Kakodkar and Dr. Paulraj will highlight the imperative for building world-class multidisciplinary research universities in India and the need for an ambitious and urgent initiative in the private sector. The full bios of all the speakers will appear in the chat box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And through the session, if any of you have questions, comments, or observations to share with the speakers, please feel free to use the Q&A box that is also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with that, I hand it over to Mr. Jha.
Thank you, Lekha. Thank you, BIC, for giving us this wonderful platform. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all our global viewers. We have two eminent personalities out here, Dr. Kakodkar and Dr. Paulraj, to discuss a very, very, very critical issue. Can India compete in the new knowledge economy? And what will it take for India to become competitive? Dr. Kakodkar, let's begin with you. If you look at the building blocks of the education architecture in India, right from primary education to vocational courses to professional engineering and medical and law colleges, liberal arts colleges, as you look at these building blocks, what do you see?
Well, thank you, Mr. Jha, and also I would like to thank Bangalore International Center for this opportunity for a very important, from my point of view, very important discussion. Coming to your question, I think education landscape across different levels, which you mentioned, as far as India is concerned, I think it's characterized by the fact that India is a very large country and a resource poor country. So you have a large number of young people. Again, there is a spectrum with them. Some get empowered through education. Many others, unfortunately, are not able to do so. There is obviously a challenge of numbers. When a resource constraints dealing with reaching good quality education, learning opportunity to such large numbers is a big challenge, and that's another feature in education landscape in India. There is also a big disparity in the country, so there is an opportunity divide even in the context of education. But what we are wanting to focus today, I think, is related to the higher education, where we're talking about empowering India to be able to compete globally. And that requires a completely different approach. We're done well. We have IITs, Indian Institute of Science, and such institutions. But I think there is more that needs to be done for us to be counted as the real top multidisciplinary research universities who can connect the frontier basic research on one side to cutting edge technology and probably appearing for the first time on the scene on the other. And that's the challenge that I think is very critical for India's future. That's how I see it.
Thank you, Dr. Kakotkar. You mentioned IITs and ISCs, and ISC and IITs are seen as the jewel in India's higher education crown. Dr. Paul Raj, you are sitting at Stanford. You're Professor Emeritus out there. From that distance, how do IITs and ISC appear to you? Are they enough to help India compete globally today, or are they just a place for very smart kids?
Thank you, Aditya, and thank you to BIC for hosting this event. And as Dr. Kakotkar mentioned, I think this is an important topic for India. So, I've been at Stanford for about 30 years, but largely involved with universities in the Western world, a little bit in China. But I know many professors at IITs and Indian Institute of Science, even today at a personal level, but not been involved over the years in any collaborative projects with Indian universities. So I have some positives and negatives in terms of interactions. Our top institutions, I think, have graduated excellent quality bachelor's and master's level students. Many of them have come to the United States and got advanced degrees from universities here, Stanford, for example, and have become leaders, global leaders in research, development, and sometimes also at business levels. In fact, at Stanford, I've recruited over the years many IIT toppers, and also from China and Europe and East Asia. And our students are as good as anybody else. So our strengths of our top institutes in India has been at the bachelor's and master's level education. We've done extremely well. I think we're now trying to pivot to world-class PhD and foundational type work. And that will take time, but nevertheless, that pivot has started happening.
But meanwhile, the world is changing. As Lekha mentioned in her introduction, you have quantum computing, you have brain sciences, cognitive sciences, you have semiconductors. Dr. Kakotkar, is there a danger that the world will get so far ahead of India, the gap will become so high that there will be a threat of sanctions, there will be a colonization of technology, withholding of technology? Is that a real danger?
Well, I think, Dr. Kalam used to say, strength respects strength. So that is also true in terms of R&D capability, that is true in terms of technology. Now, I think if you look at science technology indicators in India, and the Department of Science and Technology does publish that year after year, and you will find India is doing quite well in terms of the rate of progress, perhaps the fastest growing in terms of publications and such other things. It is, I understand it is around number 3 in terms of publication. So I think while we have a lot of ground to cover, both in terms of number of publications and more importantly, the quality of those research publications, but there is very good progress. translation of this into technology is, however, that also is picking up, but it's lagging behind. We're not at the same level as we made. And that I think government is doing quite a bit. There is a huge emphasis on startup, for example. But this is a larger problem. This is also a problem of mindset of people, for example, mindset in our society. And so we need a kind of a very conducive, vibrant ecosystem where people can work across organizational boundaries, where people can be driven by ideas, and the strength of that idea makes people work together, network together. Now, that ecosystem is just about beginning to happen, I would say. But there is a huge gap. Now, on the other hand, you have these new disciplines emerging. Now, I know, for example, you take material science. India has been, I think, quite good in as far as material science research is concerned. But we completely missed the semiconductor revolution. Now, going forward, there are these emerging disciplines, call it cognitive sciences, call it genetics, and such other things. And very soon, in fact, they have started appearing, big cutting edge technologies are appearing on that, quantum computing, for example. Now, I know we have some level of understanding in the science of these areas, but converting that into technology, it cannot be done. It has to be done in an ecosystem where industry is an integral part. And that, I think, is a bit of handicap. Things are happening, but not at the level where we can say that we are at the top of the league. That's the difference. Not that things are not happening. I think we are very proud that things are they're much better than what they were earlier. But I think we need to do more to be at the top of the league. That's how I would say.
That's wonderful to hear. Paul, can you paint a picture for our audience as to what this new knowledge economy is looking like?
Thank you. So let me, my fundamental driver for higher education in India is a pretty narrow one, and that's really to increase India's growth, because we need growth in our country to particularly lift the bottom one-third of our population. And it turns out that increasingly economic growth is underpinned by technology-enabled services and manufacturing sectors. So technology has begun to play a big role in our growth worldwide. And we can divide these sectors into two kind of groups. One I would call is medium technology, which is, though GDP-wise, a large sector, and includes service sectors, for example, like telecom networks, Jio, Airtel, or e-commerce sectors, Paytm and things like, or Ola that we're familiar with, and manufacturing sectors like autos and generic pharma. On the other and more crucial sector, R&D sector, is what is called as R&D Intensive High-Technology Manufacturing Industries. And these could include core ICT, like computer systems, telecom systems, and semiconductors. A crucial area. Right now, the big area of contention between the United States and China. And sectors like advanced instrumentation, commercial aircraft, commercial jets, patented or branded pharmaceuticals. So this high-tech sectors is becoming more and more important in the world. And the total contribution in terms of market value is about $4 trillion a year. And And this sector is very difficult to enter, very, very difficult to enter, requires very heavy investments. And if we look at the market share of countries, about 30% of this, just looking at core ICT sector, which I think is the sector which is now at center stage in the world today, the share of the United States is about 30%. The share of China is about 32%, and the balance is across Europe, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and so on and so forth. Our share in this sector is almost zero. So it's critical that India enters the high-tech sectors and also expand our medium-tech sectors. And in that sense, if you look at the pattern of growth of these high-tech sectors, they've been heavily linked to the availability of three elements: the government, research universities, top research universities, and of course the industries themselves. And therefore, I feel that for India to grow rapidly, has to pay more attention to research universities, particularly at the global scale, global levels. And I think when I say at the global levels, I'm talking about building universities which come up with innovations which have global impact and mass market global impact. And I think that challenge is still yet to be done in India. And I think it's an important challenge for the country.
Well, thanks, Paul, for that. You talked about the government, the research universities, and the industry, like a triple helix model. Before we go into the triple helix model, can we survive just being consumers of high technology? I mean, India is one of the biggest consumers of high technology, if not the producer. And what are the pitfalls in being just a very big consumer, but not a big creator, not a big producer? If Paul can take that, and after that, Dr. Kakurkar can take that question.
Yeah, so I think today, if you look at across the board in India, whether it's core ICT, when you use the internet, the Zoom link we're using today, the end devices which support it, or infrastructure we don't see, but the data centers and the telecom networks behind it, or when you fly in commercial jets to move from place to place, or when we take advanced medications. India is a big producer of generic meds, but when we get really ill, we got to take all these new medications, so patented, branded pharma medications. All of these are imported in our country, and therefore, I think we pay two prices for that. One is that, of course, it does cost cost money to import these things, and to the extent we can participate in it, that's some lost opportunity. But also, more importantly, today, I've seen in recent years, even in commercial technologies, has become part of geopolitics, and if we are, first of all, in these sectors, no country is self-reliant. I mean, whether in the United States, where I live, or whether it's China, the two dominant tech powers, and on others too, Japan or in Europe, everybody highly intertwined. So for India's sort of goal in this sector is something to, I would say, try and get about 5% market share, global market share. And we do that, we achieve a lot. But then I think we will have some ability to sort of be not only create high-tech jobs and probably produce a balance of payments, but most importantly, also protect ourselves from potential threats in terms of denial of technology. So that, I think, is a big goal.
Thank you, Dr. Kakurkar. you have gone through a lot of experiences in which the government, the industry, and the research institutes have come together. If you can highlight some of those.
Yes, I'll do that in a minute, but just let me add that in the context of the earlier question that you're discussing, I think the fact is we are living in a kind of a very competitive, but at the same time interdependent world. Now, there, if you want to secure your interests, you have to be on par or nearly on par with others, at least in some areas. There is a give and take, and you have to be always able to give, because that's what you can leverage in terms of adjusting your transactions or interactions or whatever. And it's in that context that unless you have that capability, you are always likely to be vulnerable. Even in commercial domain, one is likely to be vulnerable. And I have, of course, in atomic energy, I have seen a lot of restrictions in the strategic domain, but I have also seen restrictions coming in the normal commercial domain simply because we are atomic energy. And I think I have also noticed that when we kind of developed ourselves, became competitive, in some cases, we proved to the world that we are kind of as competitive or a little better than them. I found the attitude changed and the cooperation started emerging. So that I think is important. Now, coming to this synergy or working together of government on one side, industry on the other, and the research, multidisciplinary research on the third side. For example, in atomic energy, triple helix is a different term, and at that time that terminology also did not exist. But for example, imagine Dr. Bhabha's time. He was a person deep in cosmic ray physics, fundamental sciences, but he decided to kind of develop atomic energy program for the country. And he did realize this sensitive, and at that time there were no such serious restrictions, but he did realize that this could be a sensitive domain. And the plus side of that was that when he decided to develop a whole program, he had a full vision, including participation of industry. And of course, thanks to his great relationship with the Prime Minister of the time, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, I think there were these three parties coming together in a very curious way. And even later, in atomic energy and also in Department of Space and such, we in India, we call it mission mode organizations. But there are many other examples which they try to sort of pursue, calling it mission mode, but it doesn't work. It worked then, or it is because there is this getting together, an ecosystem of these three entities, the government, the research, and the industry. And if you notice, for example, if I had to take the example of the nuclear power reactors, which are completely indigenous, they are competing on a world-class basis. And this entire work of manufacturing or developing manufacturing capability has been done by the industry. So all three parts have come together, and I think the same thing is true with the space program. So I think this concept of the three elements coming together and working in synergy with each other is very important. And particularly going forward, this is going to be even more important when we are talking about absolutely cutting-edge technologies, first time ever.
And we can't do it without the presence of research universities, multidisciplinary research universities, in India, in the ecosystem, as part of the ecosystem, as part of the triple helix. So Paul, what do you think, based on both of yours, Paul's and Dr. Kakotkar's personal journey, what are the best practices that are required? How does one go about creating a great multidisciplinary world-class research university?
Right. Let me first pick up a small point from Dr. Kakotkar's comments, and then I'll address your question. So yes, I think in the United States, around the end of the Second World War, Dr. Vannevar Bush at MIT, I was advisor to President Roosevelt and later President Truman, and he proposed this idea of partnership between government, universities, and industry. And then began around the late 40s, and that flowered into and generated what we have today in the United States, a very powerful technology base. And of course, research universities were always a key part of this. And I would again mention that the research universities arrive or become valuable when they are able to come up with transformative technologies which are used across the world. For example, the Stanford EE department, which actually celebrated its 125th anniversary, I think a couple of years ago, recognized a few such innovations. One is public key encryption. The fact that any of us on Zoom calls or anytime we get on the website, we use that technology developed by Professor Marty Hellman at Stanford, or the microprocessor, which is, of course, is everywhere now. And it came through Ted Half, again, a Stanford doctoral student. MIMO, which I was involved with, is part of every wireless call around the world. So these are the hallmarks of a research university. So India certainly needs them. Now to come back to Aditya's question as to what makes for these top universities, I think it sort of requires 3 or 4 ingredients. One is it needs, of course, leadership to guide such institution. And typically, the top universities in the world look globally around for that leadership. So it's typical for Stanford or for MIT, or even the top universities in Singapore or Europe, to look around the world and look for the best person who can guide the university. So that kind of ability to go across the world and pick the best person is very important. Other one is access to global research talent. So you want to build a new, let's say you want to build a new activity, let's say in quantum computing. Typically, these top universities will be able to search across the world, find the best person they can, who can attract to lead their programs. When you get such a person, it really accelerate what you're trying to do. Actually, Stanford now is trying to find a leader in quantum computing, and I'm sure we're going after 1 or 2 top people. A third thing, of course, is autonomy to focus on the mission that is tasked at hand, and not to be too much distracted by external issues. And finally, of course, is funding. We do need a lot of funding, a healthy endowment, but also support for operating costs through government and industry research contracts, tuition, and so on and so forth. So these 4 elements of leadership, access to global talent, autonomy, and funding are what makes for these top universities. And talking about top universities, United States dominates there. We probably have in the top 20, about 15 of those are in the US. And Stanford, where I work, is probably among the top 2 or 3. But now China is now building universities. They have about 6 or 7 now in top 100. The Tsinghua now is close to top 20, and even Singapore now, NUS and UT are pretty high in the scale. But in all of them, it is the ability to come up with innovations which impact which had a global impact, I think is the hallmark. And so that's my comments, Aditya.
Dr. Kakotkar, one of the distinguishing features of almost every top university in the world is that they're multidisciplinary in nature. You know, they are not specific to any one discipline, whether it's Stanford or MIT or Berkeley. They're multidisciplinary. So what are the advantages that a multidisciplinary university gives over a specialized research center?
Well, there are many. One, of course, is if you want to solve important problems, then it is the disciplines which are required to be brought to bear on that problem, they should be available. And it's not the other way around. You can't define a real life problem as belonging to one discipline. But more than that, you know, this is not just a science and technology issue. This is an issue where ultimately the technology is meant for some use. So there is a user, and that user may have, you know, it could be an industry, it could be some segment of society. So it could have many connotations. I would give you a small personal example. You know, there was a time when our heavy water reactors, there were a problem of coolant channels, and the whole world was kind of on our head saying that, no, your reactors are very unsafe and you must shut them down, all of them. And this required to understand the health of components inside the reactor, and there are hundreds of them. And you required systems to know that health online and some offline. Now those things were not available, and we tried to scout for it. Nobody would give us. But there was, of course, one company which agreed to give, and it was really a high-tech stuff. We deployed it here and it didn't work. It's not a problem of technology. It was just that it was not appropriate to the kind of conditions which are prevalent here. And that appropriateness has a lot to, you know, you have to have understanding of the users, the society in which it is going to be deployed. So humanities, economics, market, all these things play an important role. So when you say multidisciplinary research university, you're not talking about just science and technology. We're talking about the whole range of discipline. And finally, we actually had to get all of them together and put them together, and they did a wonderful job. In fact, we built one of the best systems in the world, and of course, the only country to compare was Canadians because they have similar reactors, and they came and applauded, and so even in those conditions, they started talking about collaboration. But I think this multidisciplinarity is extremely important. And unless you have an ecosystem where you are doing top-line research in different disciplines, but you have them working together on common problems, that is where I think big challenges can be handled. So this is, if we have 2 minutes, I want to also give an example of Tsinghua University, for example. And
Sure.
This is in the area of nuclear. You know, it was a time when the reactors were it was in Germany and all, there was very negative sentiments about nuclear. And at that time, the graphite reactor, the high temperature reactors were being developed both in Germany and in United States. In United States, of course, General Atomics was working on that, but that had some difficulties. But the German development was very successful. And then, of course, Germany was thinking of retiring this whole thing because they wanted to come out of nuclear. Now, it was the Tsinghua University faculty, and I actually personally cross-checked with Tsinghua University faculty when I met them. And they thought they were looking at future energy scene, and China's nuclear program had picked up, and they started deploying a lot of resources on nuclear development. But these academics in Tsinghua University, they came to the conclusion that it is the high temperature reactor that is important. So in fact, they set up a separate campus near Beijing, of course. And there is a nuclear department there. There is a small reactor, I think 10 megawatts or 15 megawatts or something, which is running for maybe more than a decade or two. And the entire fuel cycle they have developed there. Today, China is the only holder of high temperature reactor technology in the world. And they are building a larger reactor now. And who is the technology holder for this larger reactor? It is Tsinghua University. So it's not just the R&D, it's not just the knowledge translated in technology, but things have happened on such a large scale in China. And that cannot happen unless you have the triple helix working together. So I think multidisciplinary research university has, according to me, very high importance. And of course, it has to be at the top level. It has, in terms of its research quality, it has to be really top of the world.
Great, thank you so much. But multidisciplinary is a critical aspect of a great university. But we have kept talking about the triple helix, and how does one get the university and the industry to work together? How does one start to prime that engine? It's an established practice in the West, in all the developed economies. But in India, it doesn't seem to be very prevalent. So Paul, how did the West actually get that engine going, the partnership between the industry and the research universities?
Thank you, Aditya. That's a good question. I'll just revert a little bit back to the remarks made by Dr. Karkotkar about the value of building a university which has different disciplines. Certainly science and technology is one, but also humanities. And because we know from history that purely experts in science and technology often cannot be trusted to deliver the best social good. And we have many examples. And therefore, the societal values like human dignity and human rights, inclusiveness, non-discrimination, these all must inform what science and technology does for society. So much in the news, for example, is artificial intelligence. We can bring a lot of good, but it can also do a lot of damage. And at Stanford, we have a large center it's called HAI, Human-Centered AI, to look at this very area and to work with scholars across disciplines in Stanford to make sure that both science and technology aspects of AI and the humanities aspects all are brought together to make sure AI is deployed in a way it helps society. So let me go back and talk to address your question about how do we kickstart the issue of how do research universities build connections with industry. Firstly, these things take time. It takes decades. Whatever's happened at Stanford and now happening also in China has taken many years. But in both of these, I think the government has been a very, very big part. For example, in the United States, even though government itself has not been investing that kind of money, it has so many institutions supporting this partnership between industry and the universities. And it funds programs, it has think tanks. And also when the industry becomes strong, we are looking for global markets. The government is heavily involved in promoting the country's products and technologies across the globe. Actually, that's not very well understood, but it's a very big part. So and for example, if you just take core ICT, which is an area where much in the news, which India would really needs to enter. Right now, our presence is almost zero. The amount of and of course in China, the government is involved in terms of actually funding this area. So if you take semiconductors fabs, it's expected that over the next 10 years, the world will spend about $3.4 trillion of R&D in semiconductors, 3.4 trillion. And of that, the Chinese government has already promised or offered to put for Chinese companies $1.4 trillion. So you can see in the US, normally the government is not a big player in funding in industries, but even that is changing. And now I think there are many bills in the US Senate, and I've had some interactions with that. We probably will at least fund 25 billion, and to probably go to 150 billion before everything gets done. So real money is, of course, is important, but even more important is many other ways the government plays a role. And in India, those institutions don't exist. There is these are handled by departments, administrative departments, and they are nowhere near the levels needed to propel India into this segment. So I think to answer your question, this is a huge gap that we have in India. So government is very, very, very critical, and certainly research universities will bring the thinking, and ultimately industry will benefit. And I should also mention that almost all these industries have to be done in the private sector. That's because these are highly competitive industries. Only the best survive. In fact, typically the best takes most of the cake. The number two may get a little bit of the pie, and there's very little left for everybody else. A very competitive sector, and only the private sector anywhere in the world can survive. So for government to work with private sector is not easy because of all the issues involved. But US is trying to handle that now in a more forcefully. China has been more successful.
Thanks, Paul. Dr. Katwardkar, if to have the partnership between the research university and the private sector and the government, there is a gap. There is a gap, as Paul mentioned, about the Indian government funding or even the US government funding compared to, let's say, China as a benchmark. But the important question is, do you feel that India has the ambition to do so? Does India have the ambition, the government of India, irrespective of the party, does India as a nation seem to have the ambition to forge ahead and go down this path of fundamental research, breakthrough technology, and being a producer, owning the IP, doing the creation, and not just being a consumer?
I think the ambition is there. The problem, the way I see, is we are groping in dark. In the sense, we don't know what is the way to go there. And particularly within the existing framework, both the governmental framework, but also the framework as it exists in the Indian ecosystem, including industry. There are, I think, these cultural issues which keep us behind, and so it looks to me that this is a kind of vicious circle, and I think we need to penetrate that. And large multidisciplinary research university, which can create enough confidence in industry by having done work for them, can actually, together with industry, create at least that awareness that, look, this is what is important, and also confidence in the path forward, which may come up out of the work between the knowledge sector and the industry sector. And I think governments, after all, we are a democracy, and once they know that there is a credible way forward, I think they will fall in line. Now, there is also an egg and chicken problem there, because unless you have good policies, you don't really move forward. And people don't make good policies because they don't know what will happen. And particularly these days when things are happening so fast, I think there is also this issue about policy making lagging behind. So there is a whole set of challenge. And I don't see any other way other than, because after all, these are all challenges of knowledge domain. And so I don't see a way other than creating a huge knowledge ecosystem. And of course, not one, but multiple such institutions, multidisciplinary. But if you have such knowledge domains, they become the guide. They become the guide for industry. They also become the guide for the governments and the society, and then bring together all the partners together. Because I don't see how it will happen. I mean, there are several initiatives I have seen being taken, but they finally fall by the wayside because of the weaknesses or the inherent drawbacks in our system. And they're not going to go away just like that. They will go away only out of experience, only out of good experience. You know, if you show success, more resources will come, more positive attitude will come. And that is where the knowledge institutions have to lead. And I think, you know, to be competitive in the emerging era, which is a knowledge era, I actually don't see any other way. So that's where I would say multidisciplinary research universities are very important.
But they're very expensive. You need, Paul had mentioned earlier, they require a lot of money. Research requires a lot of money. So my question to both of you, and Paul, please take it first. Can India afford research for researchers' sake?
Right. So that's a good point. Let me go back a little bit to Dr. Kakur's comments. First thing is, and I'm absolutely sure that once we get our mind together, India can perform and be a part of the global high-tech ecosystem, no question. Just going back to my own personal work, and I spent many years in India and did a couple of projects. And I always say in the United States that my best years, my best work was done there. And so India can do it. It's just that we need more such successes. So the other question, I think, is how do we, Dr. Kakur mentioned some of these points. I think really we must get a really frank understanding of where does India stand in high technology. I think, and that must be understood properly at the political level and at the bureaucratic level. And that gap is really vast. And I think when that gap is understood, I think we will tend to build in policies to try and bridge it. So with that, let me sort of go to your question about how do you find the funding. There's another issue of funding, and this is the kind of the chicken and egg problem. You take, for example, core ICT, semiconductors and systems. The global revenue in this segment is about 1.5 trillion. Our share is almost negligible. But what 1.5 trillion, about say 30%, so that's about $450 billion actually is plowed back as R&D. So when you sell a product and you buy a phone for $600, 30 or 40%, 35% of that what you pay goes back into R&D. So these industries are huge R&D engines, and but whatever the government does is a small fraction of this. So and therefore, and this R&D money also comes back to universities through government industry contracts. So how do we actually get in? How do we move into this area? So I think it has to be done step at a time, step by step by success. So today, for example, in core ICT, India may spend across government and private sector. I'm talking about core ICT as I defined it, semiconductors and systems, probably less than $500 million or even less. And so how do you take that to tens of billions of dollars that are needed? So I think actually setting up institutes which can make an impact and show that industry can benefit, which can spawn industries, and that with that virtuous cycle of showing small successes, attracting more funding, industries becoming, most important, industries becoming successful and getting global reach, and that funding, bringing back funding into our universities, I think is that cycle we got to start. We have to kind of start that cycle. It's going to take time, and patience, but it can be done.
It takes time, it takes patience, and we need to create a virtuous cycle. But Dr. Kakodkar, again, research for research's sake in a poor country like India, how would you answer that?
Well, I'm very clear in my mind. First of all, India is a large country, and also a large economy. We may be poor in terms of per capita income, but it's a large economy and it's a large country, and we have to survive in this, as I said, very competitive, interdependent world. Now, unless we kind of take recourse to absolutely frontline basic research, I think you cannot build new technologies. As I said earlier, we have to be able to translate that frontline research into new technologies. But if you're not done that frontline research, then you can't be doing the cutting edge technology. For example, India has been participant in several mega science programs. The Large Hadron Collider at CERN. Today, we are participating in experiments in Fermi Lab. Now, Indian scientists are participating because they are important in that area of basic research. Otherwise, they won't allow us in. We are participating because we are able to make contribution, and normally we don't make contribution by paying cash. We make contribution by in kind, in the sense you make equipment which is required. And most of these equipment actually involves technology of tomorrow. So working for CERN, for example, we learned many new technologies, whether it is in the domain of superconducting wires or superconducting technology, or in the domain of, for example, at that time we used to talk grid computing. Just like the WWW came from CERN, but when we were wanting to get into Large Hadron Collider collaboration, the grid computing was being developed, and we had the kind of opportunity to work firsthand. And we're way ahead of what we now talk parallel computing and cloud computing. These are all evolved later. But colleagues in atomic energy have tried their hand. Right? So the point is, this couldn't have happened unless we had a hand in basic research in that area. So even in our own sense, within the country, if you want to do, I think basic research is extremely important. Basic research many times, particularly experimental basic research, involves technology of tomorrow. And if you are able to master that well, you will automatically go in the front line in terms of technology. So I think a large country like India, we cannot afford to ignore any aspect of science and technology, whether it is basic versus applied, or we're talking about various applications or various domains of technology. I think we can ill afford that. In fact, if I slightly digress, if I can, Dr. Baba used to say that whenever he used to build a lab or a program, he never defined a program the way we do in normal organizational design, that I will have this, then 10 departments, and then so many pieces. He never used to say. He used to say, find a man and build a lab around him. So you find a competent person, find a person who is very innovative, who is an excellent researcher, and then fulfill all the needs that the individual has, and you will have good science delivered. And in fact, he built atomic energy on that. The first person he recruited for atomic energy program was actually a biologist. So I think there is a lot of merit to this, and India cannot afford to ignore. We're not a small country. We may be poor, but this was being talked about at the time of atomic energy. This was being talked about at the time of Department of Space beginning. Why are you having these white elephants and all? But today you see what is the service to common man these technologies are providing. So I firmly believe that we simply cannot afford to ignore anything in science and technology. The world is far too competitive today.
So we need these multidisciplinary research universities. We need them to interact with the government and with the private industry. We need them because R&D-led high-tech industries will shape the economies of the countries in the future. We need them because if we are not in a position to give, we won't be able to take from anyone. We need them because it's a question of national interest, it's a question of national economy, it's a question of national security. So we need them. We need not one, we need hundreds of such, just like the US has. China is building many such multidisciplinary research universities. We need to attract the best global talent to these research universities in India. Now, don't you feel that someone should set up something like this? Someone should go ahead and do something about it. Because role models, once we have one, to kickstart the virtuous cycle, once we have one such great university working, there will be the second and the third and the fourth coming in double quick time. I remember when I was growing up, Vishwanath Anand became the first chess grandmaster. India didn't have a grandmaster till then. And today we have about 68 or 69 chess grandmasters. So don't you feel there should be something done about it instead of just, discussing it?
Shall I respond?
Please.
Okay. Well, I think that is right. And I actually believe in doing it rather than saying it. So it was, there was a time when I was chairman of the board of governors of IIT Bombay, and at that time government actually asked the committee led by me to look at what more can be done in the context of our IITs, and of course we did that work. So it was at that time we're the part of various consultations that we're taking. Of course, IIT alumni were the important people to consult. So we used to consult a lot of people, and that is the time I came across Mr. Shailendra Kumar, and so obviously there was a large number of similar people in US and India, and they have been kind of concerned about this issue. And so progressively over consultations, I think this gathered steam, and today we have a fairly large group of a global think tank, I would say, where there are 50, 60 people who have been brainstorming on exactly this issue as to what is it that needs to be done and how it should be done. And there is this idea of setting up a multidisciplinary research university in India, that why not we kind of work together to do something about this. So through, and this has happened over years, I think 5 or 6 years, this process has been going on. And so the blueprint has been prepared, how to make beginning, where to start, what should be the philosophy. And that is what, we are all working together. This ECA grid, which was mentioned in the beginning. So we have created a legal entity. Professor Paulraj is the chancellor designate of this university, and then we have been engaged with several governments, state governments, to sort of and of course several industry colleagues, and I think there is a very wide acceptance of this idea that something should be done. I'm happy to tell you that the idea now is to have a big vision, but begin small, but do it in a manner that we create those cultures, because as I mentioned, cultural issues are extremely important. So we want to begin in a few areas. For example, want to begin in artificial intelligence as a first major focus area, and get into deep research in that area. So we want to begin not with an undergraduate program, but with research program. And then, of course, expand that into other disciplines, and also go down to master's program, graduate BTech program, and the like. And we all know that this is a more difficult thing to do rather than starting a university with the BTech level. And nobody if you just focus only on financial matters, what we are doing, people will see it's not a right. But we're absolutely convinced that you want to first seed the best of culture, get best of researchers, get them here, get them to seed a culture of research, and then once that is set, expand both horizontally as well as vertically down. So I think a lot of work has been done, and we've been looking at a site and all, and I think we're all converged on Bangalore as a site for ECA grid. So now, although I'm telling you all this, this is only minuscule. A lot of things yet to happen. We're all very conscious about that. But I think I know there are several education institutions, in fact, one time Asia's largest school system was created by an institution called Rayat Shikshan Samstha. Now it is not the largest, but at one time. And they created, this was actually meant for poor people. This is in the pre-independence era. Today that institution also is more than 100 years old, but it was all based on, public contribution. Public means not government, people's contribution. And big things can happen. So I'm convinced that because that's the need of the hour, that's what country needs. So it should be possible. So I agree with you. We're not talking about these things in thin air. There is an action plan, and with support of everybody, I think we can go forward. But maybe Dr. Paulraj can tell more.
That's great news. I mean, there is you, Dr. Paulraj, and a great team have come together to set up ECA Grid, which will be a multidisciplinary research university. And from what I heard from you, it will be a top-down approach so that the research DNA is deeply embedded. And Dr. Paulraj, I mean, can you tell us more about this?
Thank you. India today has good public sector research universities, and then I think they will develop and grow. But I do believe there's a particular value for a private research university also, Because the private research university will bring one key advantage, and that is the advantage of being able to attract a very top global talent, both at the leadership level of the university and in various research disciplines. And this, if you go back and look what's happened in China or in Singapore or even South Korea, where have good linkages, a local person, professor may get, let's say, salary of $100,000. They would hire international talent at 5 times that level, if that's what it takes to get these people. So the ability to connect with the world, source the very best talent, have the flexibility to attract them, and money is not the only aspect here. That, I think, will be the hallmark of a private research university in India. And I think the ability to connect with the world and function and attract that very top talent, I think it's also essential for India to build world-class universities. It's very difficult to bootstrap living in an island. So research universities have that huge advantage because they need to be funded adequately. So private universities will have autonomy, the mindset, and the flexibility to compete for and attract very, very top international talent. I think that makes all the difference. But no doubt, the public universities are there and they will grow. And I actually firmly believe that successful private sector universities, research universities, will actually help our public sector universities and vice versa. So this is not A versus B, but it's together. But this element of top research universities is something that India needs. I think it'll help us. And I'm very hopeful that once we can get it going, everybody will benefit, both the public and the private.
Thanks, Paul. I'm looking at some of the questions that have come from the audience, and Sudhesh Venkatesh has a very interesting question here, which is, in a developing country like India, there's bound to be competing demands for capital. And is there a greater role for private philanthropy in promoting research? And how does one create that culture like it has happened in the US? So Paul, any views? Because this ties in very much because you and Dr. Kalkotkar and your team are setting up EcoGrid, and I'm sure you're looking at philanthropic capital to fund it, to set it up. How does one create that culture? And you will be leading to, there will be others who will be setting it up as it is a national imperative. Many people will be setting up such universities. So how does, we have a history. It is the Tatas that, set up IISc in the beginning. So how does one create that culture in India?
Yeah, firstly, India needs growth. We are today probably getting close to $3 trillion in terms of GDP, but we should aspire to 15 trillion over the next 2 decades. And so the economic value of technology for the country is huge, absolutely huge, given the fact that high technology particularly will drive our growth. So that upside is clear. So therefore, I think we have to convince donors in India that this is a worthwhile enterprise in national interest. No doubt, public universities will grow and must grow, but private universities have their advantages, and therefore I think there's a very good case can be made for donorship, for donors to fund such an institution. And I think every dollar spent in these institutions, if they're well run and well managed, will repay back many times back to the country. And therefore, we have a very good case. The question, of course, is in a poor country, can we afford it? But actually, the opposite is true. In fact, because technology is such an important role in the growth of our country, money spent in such universities, if they can trigger the industry that we want to create, will actually will do the most for the most deserving, the poorest in our country. Therefore, I think it's actually money well spent to lift everybody in our country. To be an inclusive society does need, in my opinion, very top research universities which will pull the country forward. When the country goes forward, everybody goes forward. So that's my. So I think it's a very important enterprise.
In fact, the point that you made that a poor country must invest in these things because it pays back many times more. And of all the companies that were born in Stanford, their annual revenue is estimated to be $2.7 trillion, which is almost the annual GDP of India. So that's a very great point. But Dr. Kakodkar, here is a question from Sanjay Anandraman, who has got quite a few questions. You will be setting up EcoGrid. The question is, what should the reforms be in the universities for encouraging innovation? So both what kind of design the university should have to encourage innovation and how that can become a template for other universities in India as well.
Yes, so I think one is that's where when I mentioned that we want to begin from the research level and come down and create a particular ecosystem. I think that's the first point in the reforms in the university system. And then, of course, along with that, other aspects of autonomy, not just autonomy with respect to external bodies and the university, but also working within the university and the departments, individual groups. There has to be that, and I think we Indians have to learn a lot. We all fall in line when we go to other cultures and fall into that aspect. But when we come back here, we are a different class of people, and that has to change. So I think what makes us change when we go to other countries, you create that environment here so that we change here.
I would add a comment there. It's an excellent comment. Is that if you look at the universities which have come up, Stanford and all that have been in making for many years, but look at what's happened in China or in Singapore or in Korea. One of the hallmarks of these very fast-growing universities is the ability to interact and connect with the other top institutions in the world. So by various means, by hiring people, short-term, long-term visitors, sending scholars across. So connecting is much like what Gandhi used to say, keep our windows and doors open and let the winds of change blow through it. So that connectivity with the world is what has brought these institutions up quickly. And I think when we build research universities in India, that will be the hallmark. From day one, we have remained connected at intellectual levels with the top universities in the world. And that requires a different mindset, and we'll have to build that mindset. But that, I think, is the key.
Thanks, Paul and Dr. Kakodkar. There's a question from Sushant Garg. Says, it's wonderful to hear about this new private research university, EcoGrid, starting with a focus on AI. When is it expected to start? I don't know if you can, if you have a clear idea on that. And hopefully this AI research initiative will be multidisciplinary. So AI is inherently multidisciplinary, right, Dr. Kakodkar? So
yes, so of course, these things are going to take time, but we do plan to be able to at least launch this university next year. And AI, of course, AI is itself multidisciplinary, and our intention is to again there narrow it down to AI for health and AI for cyber security. These two domains we want to focus on in terms of research to begin with. And I think, for example, this question about connecting philanthropy on one side and growth of the university on the other side, that I think AI is a good area where we can do work, we can show results. Industry sees the benefit of research coming out of ECA-Grid, and that kind of enables more resources to be plowed in, both by the industry as well as the government. So I think we have to do things well so that we create a kind of a snowballing effect, as it were, to do. But we want to begin small so that, but make sure that our configuration and our culture is absolutely right. That's the way we are planning.
Let me add a couple of comments. Certainly health or medicine and cybersecurity are very, very deep disciplines, and the university must address those. And the AI is a very powerful tool today, and it has its applications all over the world, in many, many disciplines, and literally thousands of companies right here in Silicon Valley looking at those things. But AI at Stanford, for example, also has a very strong foundational base. For example, big area in AI is to build semiconductor chips which can do the training and the inference engines. And because of the recent advances in AI, called GTR4 transformer models, the model sizes in these chips now has gone to something like 10 trillion neurons. In fact, I think that the top chips are coming from China. So understanding AI hardware architectures, understanding algorithms at the deeper level is also part of the goals of will be goals of ECA-Grid. But no doubt for early payoff, its applications are also useful. So whether it's AI, whether it's of course medicine, whether it's cybersecurity, these require very foundational strengths in a university, and ECA-Grid will certainly focus on those.
Thank you, Paul and Dr. Kakodkar. There's a question from Ashish Jha on brain drain. So if we have kickstart the virtuous cycle of having research universities in India itself, many of them starting with ECA-Grid and the public sector research universities, our best brains, instead of going to other countries and contributing there, will end up being in India and contributing to India's growth. And that is one of the great benefits, because that is going to snowball into a very, very, very big gain for India.
Let me say that, let me respond there. So clearly, if you look at the countries which have come up rapidly in S&T area, they all have reversed the brain drains. From China now, almost even my own Stanford group, all the people who came from China, my Chinese students always went back to China. But from India, they always stayed on in the United States. It's a matter of opportunities. Once we see high-tech industries growing in India, I think that will automatically reverse. Right now, I think there are opportunities in India, but people perceive as, if you really want to do and work at the cutting level in industries, opportunities within Indian headquartered companies is very minimal. Of course, we can do a lot of these advanced companies in core ICT like Telecom or Intel or NVIDIA have R&D shops in India, but that is very different from actually being part of the headquarters and driving things that happens in the headquartered countries right back here. So India needs to develop that Indian headquartered high-tech industries, and that'll retain talent, and not only retain, will attract talent from around the world. In fact, I would say we'll be successful when our companies can attract talent from across the world, from the United States and from China and from Europe, to come and work in India. I think at that time we really arrive, and that can be done.
Great. There's a question, Dr. Kakodkar, if you can take this. From Mr. S.N. Prasad, how will the proposed research university, ECA-Grid, be different from existing advanced engineering institutions like IT and IST? So you've talked about being multidisciplinary, you've talked about being research first. So how else will it be different?
Well, I think it will be also more connected with the neighborhood, the industry. And so the question is, you want to do research, you want to make, you want to be able to work on important problems. Now, some of these problems, of course, you choose on the basis of the needs of research that you are doing, what that domain, what are the important problems there. Some problems arise from the perspective of the needs that are felt in the industry and in the society. In either case, I think you need to be connected. You need to be connected across disciplines. You need to be connected across segments of society. And so I always view a large multidisciplinary research university as a kind of a mini depiction of the evolved society or the society of our dreams and things like that. Now that is where on one side you do important research, and on the other side you make sure that we are most useful to all stakeholders, and that I think uh, is the way forward. And that once you do that, I think as long as we have a well set processes in terms of research culture, I think we can achieve big things.
I would just add a short comment to say that
please.
in connectivity, not only within the country, but also strong connectivity to the top universities in the
Absolutely.
world. That is very critical because we have a lot to learn, and we should not reinvent everything in our country. And that connectivity will which has been every successful university has grown in the last 25 years has plugged into the other universities and learned. So we should do the same thing.
We have a few questions which are around, that India spends much lesser, percentage of its GDP on R&D than other countries that we would like to benchmark ourselves against. That the US has DoD, National Science Foundation, etc., that provide. It all comes down to both the government and the private companies, their contribution to their spend on R&D. And I think in the discussion earlier, we had covered that point that yes, it is low in India right now, but we need to kickstart a virtuous cycle. The more good things start happening, it will start attracting more funding. And the more the creation and production happens and the entire ecosystem gets created in India itself, that will start attracting a higher percentage for R&D. Is that correct? We have already discussed that.
Yes. And I think the answer lies to being connected.
Yeah.
If industry, the academia, and the government, if they are well connected, I think this problem will get automatically solved. Today, because they are not connected, there is a sort of, I would say, a bit of lack of mutual confidence. And so the industry funding in R&D is not there. And, there is always a great synergy between government funding in R&D and the industry funding in R&D. And across the so-called technology readiness levels, the initial part has to be heavily funded by the government, and the advanced technology readiness levels, that part, the industry funding automatically comes in. But it amounts to, they're working together, comes back to the same point. And because we lack that ecosystem, you don't find that investment, or no, it's growing, things are improving, let's accept that. But if that happens in a bigger way, automatically it will, if the industry funding improves and sort of becomes equal to the government, I think crossing 1% is no big deal. We're stuck at 0.8% or lower than 0.8% for a long time. It's just this aspect, India's investment in R&D will cross 1% or 1.5%, and that will give fillip to going even further. Today, what is happening in the government feels we're investing in research, but not much is happening. Industry feels, can we take that risk? So I think it comes back to that same core idea of multidisciplinary research university, which can keep all these people connected, working with each other. I think things will fall in place.
So I think we are reaching the end of our allotted time. So let's do a wrap up. Paul, do you think India can compete in the new knowledge economy?
Yeah, absolutely. India has what it takes, and but I do believe that our gap in high tech to the rest of the world or the developed world is growing now. We're not it's not closing. We're actually expanding at this point. So it's a real alarm bells for our country. And I think as the next few decades are going to be very critical in high-end technologies, semiconductors, AI, computing, telecom, so I think building world-class research universities is certainly one aspect of trying to solve this problem. But I'm absolutely sure that that India can make it. And it has absolutely the potential to be an important player in the world. We have almost everything that's needed to go there, but it does need some new initiatives. And I think the building such universities which can come up with breakthrough technologies with global impact, that is the most important thing, is not an option, but an urgent national imperative of our country. So it's critical for our national security, our economic prosperity, and our societal well-being.
Dr. Kakodkar, it's absolutely critical to have such multidisciplinary research universities. And as a wrap-up, as culmination of lifetime of work and service in science and technology, the setting up of ECAGrid, you think will become a role model for others in India?
Yes, I'm quite convinced about it. And see, the point is we talk about moving towards knowledge economy. Now, moving towards knowledge economy in the science and technology sense is what we normally mean. Now, and that's of course very critical if we have to leave this global competition. But it's not as if with that all problems of the world have been solved. And there are, for example, there are many problems, and I'm involved in several such discussions, including several people from across the globe, where the question is why disparity is still growing. Why you get into these huge tail end risks of the kind pandemic created. Now, these are issues which has, of course, deep philosophical roots. But I think the ancient Indian heritage in the domain of knowledge has solutions to many of these. And I think ECAGrid, when we talk about multidisciplinary going forward, first we want, we can't be arguing about these things from a position of weakness. Nobody would listen to us. We must become strong in science and technology. We must become strong in terms of globally competitive technology, but then bring to bear the Indian wisdom in terms of taking the world to a better place. Because we have to solve our own problem within the country where there is big disparity, large rural domain, and I think that's also the problem of the much larger part of the world. But we can't do that sitting in a cave. We have to do that competing in the science technology domain. And I think ECAGrid provides a perfect platform to be able to achieve that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kakodkar, Dr. Paul Raj. It has been a pleasure listening to your views. Thank you so much to the audience for asking all the questions. There's a lot of questions which have not been directly answered in this Q&A session, but they have been answered during the discussion itself, like has India missed the research bus? Well, India has missed many research buses, but the question is not to look back, but to look forward. So let me just wrap it up. Yes, frontier technologies, R&D-led high-tech industries will shape the economies of countries, will be critical for the security of the countries. The triple helix model is critical to that. You have to have research universities and government and private corporations, industry coming together in a triple helix to make this a reality. We need that ecosystem. India has what it takes, but the alarm bells are ringing. We need the multidisciplinary research universities and the ecosystem around it in India. Dr. Kakodkar, Dr. Paul Raj and the team have come together to set up ECAGRID, one such university, which will be in addition to the public sector research universities like ISCs and IITs that are there. And we hope that it sets up, it kickstarts a virtuous cycle that leads to breakthroughs in science and technology that leads to economic development and societal well-being. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Kakodkar. Thank you, Dr. Paul Raj, for such a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It is imperative that the triple helix of academia, industry, and government get their act together on addressing the yawning gap in higher education and research in particular. This is necessary from a national security and competitive perspective globally. Professor Paul Raj and Dr. Kakodkar have been there, done that in the Indian ecosystem and have considerable exposure to global trends as they have persuasively argued. It's high time India focused on enabling institutes focused on cutting edge research. Our future depends on it. Thank you so much, Aditya, for expertly moderating this session. Dr. Kakodkar and Dr. Paul Raj, thank you so much for taking the time and having this fascinating conversation on our platform. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for staying on. We have over 70% of the audience still on, which is quite a feat, and asking all those interesting questions. And all I have to say now is good night and good day to Dr. Paul Raj, and see you next time, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.